These days, everybody's talking about purpose in our lives and in our organizations. But how many are actually living by a purpose in tangible, authentic ways? It's one thing to declare purpose, but it's a lot harder to actually live one. In this episode of Moments of Truth, I speak with John Rosling. He's the CEO of the Contextus Group, a London-based B Corporation. And he has spent years focused on measuring what it means to activate a purpose versus just declare one. The good news is that it's very possible to do, but maybe a bit harder than most of us think. Take a listen.
So John, as I've studied Contextus and learned more about who you are as a firm, one of the things that's been really fun is that as a certified B Corporation, it seems like you guys have made your purpose measuring the purpose for other people. With you and some of your colleagues at Cambridge and Plymouth set out to better understand, could purpose be measured? Which I think is a fascinating question. So I'd love to hear, why did you want to know?
Okay, great question. So you now need to step back just a few years into our past. So what we're asked to do by companies is help them make their company work more effectively, or more specifically, help the leadership team in organizations land their strategy. So the frustration that we get a lot is that we have a strategy, we think it's really cool, our people don't get it, they're not exercising it, we're not getting any breakthrough, I don't know why that is. And what inevitably gets in the way is people. And a lot of large organizations are not particularly good at dealing with their people. So when we get into a conversation around people, the question often in strategy or implementation of a plan is, why would anyone care? Why would anyone engage? Either at an executive level or right down the organization, which then leads to a question about why. Why do we do this? Why do we exist? How can we create a world in which people are passionately engaged in where the organization is going? And for years and years, companies genuinely used to say things like, oh, well, it's to increase shareholder value. And the truth of that is, it's a destructive strategy anyway, but actually for most employees, why would they care about that? How can I give you of my passion and my creativity and my loyalty if there is no reason why I should feel proud of those endeavors? People are meaning seekers, and therefore companies seek meaning. Now, this is not new. Companies increasingly, as you are well aware, have started to talk about purpose. But what interested us is, what is it about this idea of organizational purpose which can transform the organization? So we started to read a lot of stuff being written by thinkers and leaders in business that purposeful companies perform better. And no one ever seemed to be producing any evidence. So Larry Fink may well be right to say companies without a purpose will not do well in the long term, but I don't see him producing real evidence for that. So we wanted to understand two things. Can purpose be measured? And if it can be measured, can it be shown that purpose genuinely drives organizational performance? And if so, how? What is the causality in that relationship? So we looked around to see what other people were doing, thinking, well, we'll just borrow somebody else's methodology and we'll collaborate. And we couldn't find anything. We could find a lot of proxies. We could find measures around brand share or customer satisfaction or ESG factors, but we couldn't find anything that addressed the causal relationship between what the company says it does and how it outputs in terms of that organizational performance. So that, with our university partners and a group of pretty impressive global academics, is what we've set out to do over the last 4 years. And we think we have understood, for every organization we've looked at so far, how purpose drives the organization and why it makes a difference, the actual relationships within the company, and we can put real numbers on that. And we're excited about that because we think it helps companies work ethically, purposefully. It gives them the evidence that they need, the confidence that they need to run their companies in a socially responsible way, because they now have the evidence that it will do them no harm, and actually it might well enhance their shareholder value, at least in the midterm.
One of the things in your study found that having a purpose was insufficient. It was meaningless, that you actually had to activate the purpose, was your words. And I love that language. Talk about that, as you see, John, the difference between having a purpose and activating a purpose.
Yes, and I think you've put your finger in what you've just said, absolutely, on the issue, which is blindingly obvious that if you have an inauthentic purpose, you are duplicitous in your language, then that actually makes the situation worse, because people people don't mind working for an organization that only has an objective of increasing shareholder value. They'll accept that. They will make that compromise, or most people will. Clearly, they would rather work for a company that performs some kind of social good, but they'll accept the norm, that Milton Friedman type normality. But what they will not accept is being lied to. And therefore, if companies go, I know you think we're here just to make a load of money for our shareholders, but actually we really care about the environment, and then they act not accordingly, then people find that really frustrating and irritating. They feel fundamentally disenfranchised. And I think that's really the obvious thing, but it is remarkable how many companies don't understand that. So what we observe is a very obvious thing, which is that purpose is not about a statement. And it's remarkable how much stuff is written, even today, about purpose statements. This idea that simply by saying some words, you will change anything. And specifically, you'll change how your customers, or in our case, what we're interested in, how your employees feel. You might do fleetingly, but what changes people's beliefs and therefore their behaviors is observation of authentic action. And they don't. So they may trust you because of history, but if you then lie to them, you'll lose that trust. So in other words, what we find is that where companies say anything purposeful, it has almost no impact at all. Where they say something purposeful and then do the opposite, as far as we are able to measure that, and sometimes it's obvious and sometimes you really can't work it out, but there's a sense that it might have happened, then the situation becomes worse. So one of the key measures that we focus on is trust. And not surprisingly, where companies may have a base level of trust, which may be good or may be bad, if they pursue authentic purpose, the trust level increases quite dramatically. And that has knock-on impact in terms of how people behave, how they perform. The corollary of that is where companies say they have a purpose and then do not exercise it authentically. In other words, people don't see purpose activated. They just see it as a set of words. Trust goes down. And a more easier comparative is those people in an organization who believe the purpose is active have much higher trust levels, about 70 to 100% higher level trust levels, than those people in an organization who have the same job and the same demographic, who simply don't believe that the purpose is active. And both sets of people can understand the purpose to the same degree. So to be clear, what we can measure, which is not a difficult thing to do, what we measure is, do you understand the purpose as an intellectual concept? Do you accept it? Do you believe it? Or at least, do you believe the company believes it? And then do you see it active?
So I want to dig into the beyond the trust. So you found two other dimensions besides trust that you thought takes to activate purpose. You talked about ownership and context. Love those words. Talk more about what those mean and how they create activation.
Okay, so that's a brilliant, beautiful question. So we have an observational model. We have observed great entrepreneurial businesses in Europe and in the States and actually in Asia and Australia over many, many years. And we tried to codify what we think of as entrepreneurial business, but you can read that as being agile, innovative, creative, fast growth. What is it that these companies are doing that the classic corporate organization fails to do? And we observed that we saw purpose in the organization, that the companies really knew exactly why they did what they did. That tended, but not always, but tended to be pro-social because that tends to activate people's emotions. But there was a gap between those companies that kind of talked about purpose and the impact it had. And we wanted to know what sat in that gap. So we spent many years really trying to understand this. That's where those three words came from. So we observe companies, any size of organization, that where there is a lack of trust, as we've discussed, certain behaviors are deactivated. And the same is true of ownership, which is really interesting. And the two are very closely related, because if I don't really trust the organization, and I'm not really talking about morality, or I'm really talking about whether I feel safe, that I feel psychologically safe. I feel that this culture, this community is there to look after me, and I don't have to feel fearful. That's what we mean by trust. And if that isn't present, it's very difficult for people to feel a sense of emotional ownership, because they will be fearful and therefore they won't own it. Now, what happens then is they won't take responsibility for action. So you can talk about your purpose as much as you like, but it's not my purpose, because I don't feel emotionally attached to it, because I can't, because I don't feel safe. I don't feel trusting. So it then becomes an intellectual exercise. So you can, in the same way that you can see that purpose without trust disables, for example, we talked about innovation and compassion. Purpose without ownership disables engagement. And also it disables alignment. And actually also, really interestingly, autonomy, that people will not behave autonomously in most circumstances if they don't engage, and I use the word advisedly, don't engage with the purpose because they don't own it. They don't have that sense of ownership, which is really about taking responsibility. And the really interesting thing about autonomy, I said, in most cases, there is a small subgroup in every company we've studied who don't care at all about the purpose, but they are quite autonomous. And the disconnect there is because they genuinely don't care. They are there purely to serve themselves because no one has given them any good reason why they shouldn't, because there's no compelling why in the organization. So they act very autonomously and quite destructively. So autonomy is 99% of the time a great thing in companies, but it has to be guided by a common purpose. Autonomy without purpose is chaos.
So I want to go back to the financial services company you mentioned before. I saw that they had achieved some remarkable results in their sense of purpose. What I found interesting was that when they came to you, they were seeing the symptom of low engagement and had concluded that the problem was, we don't know why our people are checked out, which is, I always laugh when clients come to us and the problem's the culture, the problem's, nobody understands the strategy or some bizarre symptom that they've just, hammered to death and got no results on. And they just assumed the purpose was misunderstood, but you found otherwise. So talk about their story, what you learned there and why the results were what they were.
So this is a very large organization, and we were dealing with a small part of the organization. So it's a division, and therefore I can't say how typical it would be yet because we haven't yet done the rest of the organization. But they are a financial services company, not uncommonly in financial services, highly regulated industry, tends to be quite autocratic and hierarchical. People feel a relatively low level of trust. And these organizations are very, very keen. Their people should be engaged because out of engagement, they think they'll get loyalty, and that's good because losing people is expensive, but also they'll get compliance and they'll reduce risk. So there are lots of good reasons why you want your people to be engaged. And so in common with most companies, but particularly financial services companies, they measure engagement a lot. And they couldn't understand why it never changed. In fact, it was going down. And actually, one of the things they did, and there's an irony in this, is the chief executive of this company made a major play on purpose. And they were very proud of their purpose. And having spoken to the guy about it, he is genuinely committed and he genuinely believes, and his board bought it. I mean, he had battles, but he got his board to buy that the bank was going to come out and say something that it believed. And what really mystified them was the more they talked about purpose, the worse it appeared to get. In this particular division, now this may not be common. They were a retail customer-focused division. They had some problems. So there was a lot of the other sense of the word context around this, that this was not necessarily a happy place. And they had a new director came in and he genuinely wanted to pursue purpose, but felt that the conversation that the bank was having around purpose wasn't really a purpose conversation. It was a CSR conversation. It was about kind of brand purpose.
Yeah.
So he tried to engage and get his people engaged, and it really wasn't working. So we went in, and what happens when people take this index is it's a questionnaire. So they took the questionnaire, and the numbers in trust were absolutely shocking. We've never seen anything like it. I mean, you would expect most organizations to be scoring, the numbers don't mean anything in themselves, but scoring around about 70, let's say. And this bank was scoring 18 at the worst. And we've never seen anything like it. And actually, when I say it was scoring 18, there was a specific community that was really, really low, which was middle management, and mainly male middle management. And they'd been in the company for 5 to 10 years. They'd reached a certain point, and they were the absolute classic frozen middle of the organization. And given how this organization had treated them over previous years, it wasn't wholly surprising that they didn't feel a strong sense of trust. And they were a definitively clear group of people who were going, now they're lying to us. So yeah, I know why the bank exists, and now they're pretending to me that we perform some kind of social function. You know, you wait, next month my mate will lose his job, and all that kind of cynicism. And actually the leadership was really committed to do it differently. And so they were shocked by this. Their instinctive reaction to seeing those numbers was that it wasn't an engagement problem, it was a trust problem. And the trust was the source and the engagement was the outcome. And actually more serious than the engagement issue was issues around compassion, but also issues around velocity of thinking, clarity of management, all those sort of things. And what was sitting right at the source of this was activation of purpose, and whether the purpose was trusted. So trust, really, because they understood the purpose. I mean, it was on every wall in the bank. So what their initial reaction was, oh, we must get some consultants in. And what I hope to say to every client that we talk to is, you have all the internal resources you need to solve human problems. If you do need external help, and you may well do, get your external help to help your people become confident to act as people. Don't expect someone to come and solve it for you. Although we're a consultancy interventions company, where we're much more excited about being a measurement company, because we see the leverageable power in terms of making a difference of the numbers that allow them to understand that it is not working. Because my conversations with these guys is often, it really frustrates me that the middle management is not acting on this stuff. You know, we've given them all the materials they need. We've given them whatever. We're clear about it. Why aren't they? What is it? And you kind of go, well, there's about 100 reasons why it's not happening. But at least if they have some numbers that they recognize, that are kind of reliable KPIs that look a little bit like the other numbers they have in the company, they can start to understand who, where, why, and when people are not engaged with this conversation. What is stopping it? And if we can say, your women in Milwaukee under the age of 35 have a fundamental source issue around this, then they can address that for those people and not worry about, the old men in London or whatever, to be trivial about it. There is a sense that if we can give them the metrics, they can pull the right levers and things will change. But actually, even more importantly than that, the inauthenticity will be exposed, because we're often asked, do we measure whether there's a good purpose or not? Do we measure the quality of the purpose? And I go, no, that's irrelevant. What we measure is whether it's having any impact on the humanity in the organization. And it is worth saying, we are only interested in the humanity in the company. We don't extend it to customers or supply chains, not because they aren't important. It's just that no one else seems to be doing the job. And I think if you're going to influence anybody, you've got to start with your employees. So what happens is you'll find out if your purpose is any good because the way your people respond to it. So if I can show you how your people are responding to that purpose and what's stopping the ones that are not responding positively, what's preventing them from investing emotionally in this, then that will help the companies to be authentic.
Have you ever wondered what it would mean for those on your team to truly live by clear, shared values? On this episode of Voices, Sarah Gaither, Assistant Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University, joins Khalil Smith as she helps us understand identity and the power of articulating the values of your team to create space for everyone's voice and contribution. Take a listen.
First and foremost, I would just love if maybe you could just kind of introduce yourself a little bit and then define for me, like when you hear speaking up or voice or any of those kind of topics, like how do you think of it?
Well, my name is Sarah Gaither. I'm an assistant professor in the psychology and neuroscience department at Duke University. I'm trained as a social psychologist, which means I study human behaviors, all the decisions we make, including good decisions and bad decisions, and how it is we interact with people who are different from ourselves on a daily basis. When I think of the word speaking up, lots of definitions come to mind. But for me, it really defines a moment when you feel motivated to either speak up on behalf of yourself or on behalf of another person or another group, something that's usually linked to increasing awareness about a given issue, increasing awareness about a given inequality. And you really end up having the surge of emotions during this instance of speaking up and trying to decide, is this the right moment for me to disclose how I'm feeling about issue X or issue Y. For me, the word speaking up also connects a lot to what we've been hearing a lot since the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, and this word of allyship and who speaks up for whom, and what are the benefits that come from people when they do speak up from higher status groups on behalf of lower status groups. And so one thing I always like to make super crystal clear to people is that being an ally as an identity researcher is not an identity that anyone should actually be claiming.
Interesting.
Practicing allyship is really a behavior, right? And it should be what you're doing on behalf of other groups and not just retweeting something, right? So this behavioral manifestation of allyship as it relates to speaking up is something that I've been following a lot in the media over the past few months. So hopefully that kind of answers your general question there.
It does. Now, I would love to dig a little bit deeper because, again, part of what I've really enjoyed about the time that I have spent with you is that you have been both somebody who speaks up and somebody who is very active about kind of lifting up other people's voices. And so I would love to just kind of understand, how has this manifested for you over the course of your career or life? And then kind of as a tangent to that as well, how do you create an environment for other people where they feel comfortable speaking up?
Yeah, so lots of responses there. I think, this was, my whole identity has been a life journey. And so I'm biracially identified. I'm biracial Black, white. My dad is Black, my mom is white, but clearly I look the way that I do. So that's been a confusing part of my own sense of self. Passing as white, presenting as white, whatever words people want to use for describing me. I have an incredible amount of privilege in every space that I go into, right? And so I think for me, it's been a struggle internally to see how differently my mom and my dad have been treated across my life growing up in an interracial family, and then also learning about the privilege I do have in my ability to speak up in spaces where other people cannot speak up as easily. And so it really wasn't until I got hired at Duke that I felt truly validated, I think, not only in my biracial identity, but my ability that the work that I do, seeing multiracial experiences, cross-race interactions, really does matter. So this was a long time across my life before I really felt comfortable doing so. And now in my lab at Duke, we have 25 undergrads every single semester working in my lab, 4 grad students, 2 postdocs from every different identity you could think of. And what I've tried really hard to instill in our lab is that everyone knows it's a family space, right? So I think this branding of what a community or an organizational group is really, really important to make sure that all voices are heard. And my lab attracts underrepresented students. And I think what I've learned over time is the privilege of looking as white as I do gives me opportunities to help create platforms for students or underrepresented groups who historically have been overlooked. So that's sort of been my own coping mechanism for wanting to look more stereotypically biracial, is trying to give other students who might not have the opportunities to speak up a platform for the first time.
Now, I'm curious, what does that look like? What are some of the practices or the tactics that you put in place to help other people find their voice? Because I think, some of the people that will be watching will either be, students or leaders or individual contributors that are like, okay, I'm maybe starting to find my own voice a little bit. But to your point around allyship really being a behavior and what that looks like and how to do it, tips, tricks, recommendations, what would you say?
I think it's pretty variable, right? Depending on who you are as a person, what experience you've had speaking up or not speaking up before. What I think is really challenging is some spaces are going to be easier to speak up in than others, and some spaces are going to be safer for you to do so, right? And so when people are thinking about how do I become an advocate for the first time, or how do I practice allyship for the first time, it can be really terrifying in that initial moment for saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing. So I find for individuals who haven't been an advocate for others very much, starting small. So one thing we did in our lab this semester, particularly during a COVID time when a lot of us were working virtually, was we created a whole lab written value statement for our lab website. All of our undergraduates, grad students, so status in the lab did not matter at all. Everyone could anonymously contribute by name. And it was a really wonderful process to get everyone's voices into one space. And I think it was a good practice experience, particularly for some of our undergrads, to really think through what they value and how seeing that in written public form, how that translates to a real world society, right? So this is on our website now for everyone to see. And I think those types of opportunities can help shed light on the process of, again, giving someone a voice who hasn't had a voice before on certain platforms.
That's awesome. And it sounds like in some ways, part of what that does is also help to mitigate some of the bias that I think is natural in any of our conversations or interactions. And so that's a great example, but I'm just curious, how do you actively manage or mitigate against some of those biases? Because my own, myself over the course of my career, I've had the fortune of working with both folks outside of the US and in the US, and folks that are virtual and folks that are in the same physical space. And we all have our kind of personal preferences and the ways that we connect with others. And I'm curious if you kind of have any thoughts about that, or any things that you've intentionally done, especially as you think about having such a diverse group of people that you work with and mentor and support.
I think one piece of advice I tend to give people who work in very kind of diverse organizational spaces is to not assume that everyone knows the same thing. I think we make that error a lot as bosses, as employers. And so I really, whenever we hire someone new to the lab, I assume they know nothing about the work that we do. And we start from ground zero just to make sure that everyone is on the same playing field. Because that's when you end up creating these kind of unheard, unseen inequities within a group, right? Is you have different students with different expertise and backgrounds. Some of them are going to be more computer science heavy and some of them aren't, right? And so figuring out where their strengths and weaknesses are is something else that I find really valuable, at least within my lab setting. So if there's a student who's really terrified about statistics and analysis, they would be assigned less data management stuff, right? Because there's no need to create more threat for a student in today's modern age. But if they really they have a keen eye for, face stimuli, they become my Photoshop go-to research assistant, right? So anytime we're making new stimuli for a study in the lab, so really figuring out which skill sets each student or worker in your group has been a way for me to also become more aware of my own biases of which students I think might be good at a certain task versus bad at another task. And the other thing that I think I've learned is to really just be a good listener. That sounds very basic, but I think we're actually really bad as humans in listening to other people and to learn from them what makes them nervous in the lab or what they're worried about when they come in for an experimental session or something like that. And so for me, listening, having virtual coffee hours, other more relaxed environments to really hear about what's working well, what's not working well, has really opened up my eyes to the different types of power dynamics that might even happen between undergrads. Right?
That's awesome. All right, final question, then I will stop peppering you. What would you like to see more of? Like if you could snap your fingers and everybody that's going to see this could do more of a certain thing or less of a certain thing as it relates to really either speaking up or creating environments where people are comfortable speaking up, like what would be that wish or that thing?
I think I would love for people to just be nicer. Maybe that's too basic, but I guess by nicer, I mean, having some more empathy for each other. I think particularly during this COVID time right now, a little empathy goes a long way, and not assuming that everyone has access to the same resources right now, not making those assumptions about someone's given working space or why an assignment may be late, right? There are a lot of things going on in people's lives right now, and being able to disclose those things to an employer is just impossible, I think, in our current climate. And so I would really hope going forward that this entire new situation we have found ourselves in will make us nicer, more empathic toward each other, and really just being able to perspective take a little more, because that's what will help reduce this increasing polarization that we're seeing in the United States right now. We all hang out with people who think like us and act like us and talk like us. And a little more listening, a little more caring, I think can expand our social groups to help make less of this us versus them comparison that we know ends up leading to such horrible outcomes.
I do not think that is basic at all. I think that is absolutely amazing. I am on board, anything that I can do. So thank you for the time. Thank you for sharing your insights and your practices and your wisdom and all of the wonderful stuff that you've been doing. And thank you for sharing your time with me. I know it is a precious commodity right now. You've got a lot going on, so I absolutely appreciate it. And I will talk with you very, very soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.
What would happen if everyone in your organization actually believed that the things you claim about your company were sacred and true? And because they did, they came to work every day passionate about personally embodying those claims. What would that look like? What would be different from today? How would it feel to work at such a place? How does it feel not to? Defining and embodying your organization's identity takes courage, self-honesty, and perseverance. The decision not to, or to simply assume things are close enough, is a decision to risk being the headline in your worst nightmare. While I'm not a fan of justifying this work as a form of scandal avoidance, any sort of motivation is better than leaving things to chance. But setting out to be who you say you are because you want to be seen as an organization and a leader of integrity, a company where actions and words align, that's the ideal reason to make changes. It may well be the hardest thing you ever do, but I can promise you fewer things in your professional or personal life will be more rewarding or transformative. Till next time, keep leaning into your moments of truth so that you can be the example of what it means to be honest.